that we hear today. I am excited to introduce our speaker for today, Professor David Wilkins. He is the Lester Kissel Professor of Law, Vice Dean for Global Initiatives on the Legal Profession, and Faculty Director of the Center on the Legal Profession and the Center for Lawyers and the Professional Services Industry at Harvard Law School. He has written over 80 articles on the legal profession in leading scholarly journals and the popular press, and is one of the leading casebooks in the field, is the co-author of one of the leading casebooks of the field. His current scholarly projects include Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, and a couple other projects, and we're so excited to hear his thoughts on how lawyers can be social engineers today. So excited to welcome you all to this session. Please feel free to stay active in the chat, and we will have a Q&A after Professor Wilkins is done speaking. So without further delay, I'm sure to start hearing from Professor Wilkins. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiara, and thank you for all the people at Crossroads who put this wonderful event together, but mostly thanks to all of the 100 or so of you from around the world who are here. When Tarun told me about this group, I was very excited to be a part of your meeting today because you really are the future. You are the leaders of the future around the world. And it's an honor for me to interact with you. As Tiara said, I actually study lawyers around the world. I run a project called Globalization, Lawyers, and Emerging Economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it for short. Some of you may know that was the title of a popular television show in the United States. I don't sing and I don't wear a tracksuit, but I do study how globalization is reshaping the market for legal services in the important emerging economies of the global south around the world, of which many of you are from. And I understand that some of you are interested in becoming lawyers, and even those of you who are not interested in becoming lawyers undoubtedly will interact with lawyers. I'm going to talk today mostly from the perspective of events that started here in the United States, but really are events that are being felt all around the world. And again, from the focus of the legal profession, but that I think will interact all of you in whatever the careers you choose to pursue after you finish your education. I've got a presentation here. I have some slides which I'm going to share in a moment, which mostly track the presentation, which I hope will make it easier for those of you to follow around the world for whom English might not be your primary language, although I understand all of your English proficiency is terrific. And then, as Tiara said, I hope we'll have time for question and answer, particularly how you see these issues, perhaps from the perspective of your part of the world. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Just 1 second. So can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my presentation? Everybody can see? Terrific. Thank you. I see Saad has got his thumb up very high there. Thank you very much. Okay. So the title of the presentation is called Social Engineers for Justice in a World on Fire: The Role of Lawyers in Building a More Just and Sustainable World in the Wake of COVID-19. So here's how I want to begin. I want to begin with an event I'm sure all of you have heard about, even if you're not from the United States. And that's, of course, the killing of George Floyd. And it's hard to believe, but it's been over a year now, 14 months almost, in which a police officer named Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis Police Department knelt on George Floyd's neck, an unarmed Black man arrested for a relatively petty crime for more than 9 minutes until he was dead. And he did this notwithstanding the fact that there was a crowd of onlookers watching, and a young woman, not much, actually not even older than you, younger than you, who filmed it on her iPhone, who just won a Pulitzer Prize for her work bringing this to light. And this event, as you know, sparked protests about the killings of unarmed Black men and women by the police and other similar kinds of injustices. The protests started in Minneapolis, spread around the United States, but then spread around the world. And I saw protests around these and other related similar issues in everything from London to Sao Paulo, to Nairobi, Johannesburg, Eastern Europe, all over the world. Now, let's be clear. The jury is still out. That's an American phrase, meaning we don't know yet whether this will produce meaningful legislative change to try to prevent police misconduct. There's something called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which still remains stalled in Congress. But what is certain is that the continuing power of Mr. Floyd's murder to galvanize action in a whole variety of spheres. And that's really what I want to talk about today. And some of you may have seen this very poignant image in which George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, her name is Gianna, was at a protest rally. She was on the shoulders of actually a former NBA player named Stephen Jackson. And what she said was really so poignant. She said, "My daddy changed the world." And the question is, will he? And a lot has to do with what amazing young people like you think, feel, and do. So we certainly know this. The world is changing, all right? As some of you who are from China know this phrase, may you live in interesting times. We certainly live in unprecedented times where there's not one, not two, but three related crises. We obviously have a global public health crisis in the coronavirus pandemic. We have a global economic crisis, which is being felt very strongly in many places around the world as many businesses shut down and many people were prevented from working. And as the George Floyd issue highlights, we have increasingly global calls for social and racial justice. And all three of these things have exposed deep structural challenges that, as Harvard Business School and a university professor, that's the highest level of professor we have, her name is Rebecca Henderson, wrote in an important new book that was actually published in January 2020, so right before the events that have galvanized us. And she said that the world is on fire because of these deep structural inequalities. And therefore, even after the current crises fade, even after we are all vaccinated, which hopefully will not be so long, even after the economy recovers, even after people no longer protest George Floyd or other kinds of killings, these deep structural inequalities will remain. And all of these pose real challenges and have real implications for the role of lawyers and the justice system more generally. And we can see that by looking at just how global we are and yet how local still matters, right? So the rapid rate at which the virus, the economic shutdown, and the protests have spread around the world underscores that how interconnected we are, that what happens in one place happens now increasingly in every place. And yet, we've also seen that there are tremendous differences in the response to these shocks from country to country, or even within countries, states or regions, or even cities, underscore just how important local conditions and local leadership still are. Hence this idea of glocal, which is just global and local kind of smushed together, right? And what we see is that governments and businesses are moving to insulate critical aspects of their supply chains from globalization, even as they continue to serve global markets and to be influenced by global markets. That's a big part of what my globalization project is all about. And this has huge implications for issues of diversity and social justice more generally, right? As we know, as global growth has slowed, driving down overall demand for everything, we know that there is a danger that issues around social justice will also slow. There's a phenomenon that the economists in the room know of: last hired, first fired. Meaning, if you're from a disadvantaged group, whether that's a religious minority or a racial minority or gender or sexual orientation, that you're often the last to be hired and the first to be fired when the downturn comes. But there's also opportunity as cities and other organizations try to provide kind of new ways of doing business. And the example here I'm using here is from New York City, which many of you know. It has this thing called the Circular City Initiative, in which what they're trying to do is to source more of what they do in local communities, but that has been a real benefit to minority and women owned enterprises. Because they are more likely to be in a local environment instead of a global one. And companies here in the US, and I'll come back to this in a minute, are realizing the purchasing power of Black Americans and other racial minority groups, which many estimated $1.5 trillion just here in the United States. And that, of course, is then putting a new focus on technology. You know, before the pandemic, you had to convince lawyers and other people that technology was going to have a major effect on the way they operated their business. Now we're all living our lives on Zoom. And no one thinks, even after there is a vaccine, that we're going to go back to the old ways of working. And places like Facebook and Twitter and even a big global law firm called Linklaters have already announced that they're going to continue working from home policies. And this is just the beginning, right? Technology is more and more going to reshape the way in which we live and work. And once again, this has critical implications for issues of diversity, access, social justice, economic opportunity. It's not that people aren't working hard. All the studies show that people are actually working quite hard in work from home environments, and that the work quality is quite good. And we also know that technology can have an equalizing effect. Quite frankly, we could never convene this group of crossroad leaders if we had to meet in person, right? Many of you would never, ever be able to have access to the kinds of academics and business people and leaders and scholars that Crossroads provides if we didn't have a technology platform like Zoom. But we also know that it's much harder to build community and collaboration online, and even more to avoid some of the problems of burnout that are becoming very clear in the working world. I had a friend when at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I said, "What's it like working from home for you?" And she said, "I'm not working from home, I'm sleeping at work." Meaning that the boundary lines between work and home have been erased, right? And once again, these issues are more likely to affect women and people of color and other disadvantaged groups around the world who are already having trouble building relationships and gaining access to informal networks and juggling commitments between work and home, commitments that have become even more acute as people work from home. And in my country, the number of women who have left the workforce is really quite alarming as they try to juggle all of these competing demands. And again, just think about all the ways that law is going to be changed because of what we're going through, right? We're already trying to decide, how are we going to redesign courts and other legal institutions around the world for a hybrid future? You know, all the court systems of the world shut down for almost a year. And again, nobody thinks that they're going to go back fully in person. There's going to be some kind of hybrid future. How can we protect fundamental rights like privacy, in a world in which these considerations also must be balanced against public health. Take contact tracing or vaccine requirements for healthcare workers. What will it take to ensure fair and equal access to everything from government benefits to vaccines, particularly for poor and marginalized Indigenous people of color who have a hard enough time normally getting access to benefits? How are we going to jumpstart economic development and ensure that businesses and governments work collaboratively to develop, navigate, and enforce sensible regulatory policy? Again, if you look at vaccine production, governments can't do it on their own, nor can the private sector. There has to be a collaboration. How do we ensure that works? And last, but certainly not least for this group, what can we do to advance global governance that promotes global solutions to what are increasingly, as I said before, global problems, and ensure that the benefits of globalization are more equally distributed? This is a big challenge for lawyers, right? Because all of this will require new laws and new regulations, both nationally and globally. And yet law is only a part, and oftentimes not even the most important part, about solving these problems, right? Take the coronavirus. It's a engineering problem of manufacturing. It's a medical science. It's a chemical problem. It's a social problem of how do we convince people to take medication. It's a huge set of problems, right? And to address these concerns, we need lawyers who understand that they need to provide more than just legal solutions. They have to be part of, but only a part of, creating actual solutions to complex problems that extend far beyond law. And as the pandemic and the protests have laid bare the deep structural inequalities that underlie these current crises, it's equally clear that these solutions have to be sustainable as well as equitable if they're going to work. So that means we need to think a lot about the social responsibilities of business. And you've probably heard this from Tarun and from others because he's such an important figure in this. But those of you who study economics may know this famous phrase by this famous economist here in the United States, but I think most kind of businesses adopted this model. In 1970, Milton Friedman said, the social responsibility of business is to increase profits, period, the end. That's what business is for. It's not clear anybody or any business fully subscribed to this, but this was kind of the prevailing wisdom. But even fewer investors doubted that what you had to do was maximize profits. That's what drove business. And given the power that corporations have, it has a dramatic consequence if all they think of is increasing the value of shareholders and the value of their companies. But even before the current crisis, this taken for granted assumption was being challenged. So in 2018, a couple of years ago, BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager, declared that it would, quote, look beyond the bottom line to invest in businesses that contribute to society. This was followed up by a statement by something called the Business Roundtable, which amended its definition of what the purpose of a corporation is. Why do we have a corporation? To include duties not just to shareholders, but to all the company's stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, and even the communities in which the company lives. In January 2020, right before the world fell off the cliff, BlackRock again issued a second letter that said it would immediately stop investing in companies that have a, quote, high sustainability risk, okay? Meaning, oil companies, coal companies, right? That is a huge change for this big investor. And here's the thing, by highlighting the deep structural inequalities in everything from healthcare to employment, COVID is likely to accelerate this trend towards putting issues of sustainability on the agenda of business. And if anybody doubted this, just last July, the World Economic Forum, which is kind of like the most prestigious business organization, business gathering in the world, adopted a resolution that called for a, quote, great reset of capitalism in the wake of the pandemic. To paraphrase another popular TV show, maybe some of you have seen, it's called Orange is the New Black. You could argue that green, meaning sustainability, is becoming the new black for corporations. And I just did a major presentation to a group of directors of large corporations in the United States. And the number one topic they were discussing is, what is the impact of sustainability on corporate management and policies? Okay, but since the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it's now clear that racial and social and economic justice must also be a part of this broader sustainability agenda. And we have seen a number of companies, particularly here in the United States, and again in the Q&A, I'd be interested to hear what people think of this around the world, are putting real resources behind this commitment. So not surprisingly, it started with statements and symbols. So many of you know we had a big civil war in this country around slavery, and yet the Confederate flag, the flag of the insurrectionist South, was still displayed prominently in state capitals and at sporting events. That's now been almost completely banned. And many companies have put out statements around racial and social justice and institutional racism that had never happened before. But now a lot of companies are going further. Big companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, PayPal have pledged billions of dollars towards funding racial justice organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, creating hiring and supplier diversity programs, and even creating sustainable investing bonds, such as Google's parent company, Alphabet, which just floated a $7 billion sustainability bond. And even major investors are now looking not just at sustainability, but at social and racial justice and equity issues. So Goldman Sachs, which is the leading investment bank in the US, and Legal and General Investment Management out of the UK, say they will no longer support initial public offerings if there's an all-male board, or they will vote against directors from FTSE 100 or S&P 500 companies if there are no Black, Asian, or ethnic minority directors. And there are similar measures being adopted around the world. Europe actually leads the way in thinking about gender. So, to stick with the metaphor, maybe it's not just that black is the new green, that green is the new black, but maybe black is the new green, okay? And this is an apt metaphor when we think about how social justice initiatives and law have kind of been linked in this country. So in 1930, there was a Black lawyer who graduated actually from Harvard Law School, one of the very first Black lawyers to graduate from Harvard. He became the vice dean of a historically Black law school in the United States called Howard Law School. And when he took over Howard, he said, I'm going to turn it into a training ground for what he called social engineers for justice. And he said, I'm doing this because a lawyer is either a social engineer for justice or a parasite on society. Okay, he was a kind of a tough guy if you want to be a lawyer. But he trained a whole cadre of Black lawyers who then went out and challenged legal segregation in the United States. He developed what he called a step-by-step litigation campaign in which they challenged one law after another law after another law. eventually ending in a very, very famous Supreme Court case. That's our highest court here in the United States, called Brown versus Board of Education. And that case outlawed legal segregation of blacks and whites in the school system, and eventually led to the banning of all explicitly racist laws, meaning segregation laws in the United States. As in a famous book by Richard Kluger, if you're really interested in this, it's a wonderful book published in 1975. And what he argues is that Brown rescued the promise of American democracy, which is chiseled in the walls over the doorway of the Supreme Court of the United States. It says equal justice under law. But that had never been true for the first 150 years of American history. It was only in 1954, when this case was decided, that it became at least the aspiration, the real aspiration of our legal system. And he rescued our legal system from the sin and hypocrisy of slavery in the United States and of Jim Crow segregation laws. But here's the thing. For the first 10 years, even after that court decision, nothing really happened. Segregation remained. Schools remained just as segregated as they were before. Another famous book, if you're a political scientist, is by Gerald Rosenberg, who shows that basically from 1954 to 1965, there was no change in segregation in America. It took mass protests in the streets, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who many of you have heard of. But there were also other brilliant leaders like John Lewis and the Reverend C.T. Vivian and Verdon Jordan, all of whom we tragically lost this year, all of whom died, to change this reality. So law is never enough by itself, right? A proclamation by a court is never enough by itself. Instead, it took mass protests in the streets. And those protests resulted in real legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, all of which guaranteed for the very first time real access and equality for Black Americans. And these laws in turn put pressure on all segments of American society to finally begin to desegregate, including in higher education. And there's been progress. Just looking at the legal profession, there was a famous study in the late 1960s of what law firms, big law firms, looked for when they hired lawyers. And this is what they said. They said, we want men who are Nordic, have pleasing personalities, clean-cut appearances, are graduates of the right schools, have the right social backgrounds and experience in the affairs of the world, and are endowed with tremendous stamina. Those of you who want to become lawyers know lawyers work very hard. Listen, in 2020, we've made a lot of progress, in part because there are not enough clean-cut Nordic guys to go around. If there's anybody from the Nordic country, that doesn't mean to take offense. The profession is far more diverse today than it ever was. And so is America. America is rapidly on its way to becoming a, quote, majority minority country, meaning white Americans are going to be a minority in the United States by 2045 at the latest, right? And all lawyers are increasingly operating in a diverse global environment that will put a premium on what I call cross-cultural fluency, which you're learning right now at Crossroads. But we still have so long to go. I wrote an article in 1996, 25 years ago, called Why Are There So Few Black Lawyers in Corporate Law Firms, right? And I wrote it because 4 decades after Brown versus Board of Education, Black lawyers were still only 2% of the junior lawyers and less than 1% of the senior lawyers in the top law firms in the United States. Now, there have been a lot of changes since 1996, not the least of which was the election of Barack Obama, another Black Harvard Law School graduate. I'm very proud of him. His wife, Michelle, is also a Black graduate, and she was my student. So I'm very particularly proud of her. But when we look at these law schools, law firms, they're still not much better. Instead of 2%, it's 4%. And Black partners are only 2%, okay? And in 2019, there were 7 major law firms that had no Black partners. And while things are slightly better for other US racial minorities, they still make up only 12% of the entire population of lawyers, okay? Yet, integration makes a difference because many of the initiatives that I just described to you are the result of Black lawyers and other racial minorities attaining some positions of power in the United States. And they are following in the footsteps of this legendary lawyer I told you about named Vernon Jordan, who sadly died today, not today, this year, who had become a kind of leading figure in the corporate world, a real pioneer. And he made sure that corporations paid more attention to racial and social justice issues. And while we still have mostly white men in positions of power, nevertheless, we are seeing those minorities and women who come into corporate positions of corporate power and authority pushing to underscore that the current system is unsustainable, as Rebecca Henderson argues in that book. She calls it extractive capitalism, where a smaller and smaller percentage of people extract a larger and larger percentage of society's resources. This is not just an American problem. It's not just a Western problem. It's a global problem. And that is unsustainable, even for the very businesses who practice the extraction, because it destabilizes the markets and the institutions that businesses need to survive. And your generation is in a position to push these issues even further. So one of the things I often say that has been lost in all the things that happened in 2020 was it was the first year that you, Gen Zs, as I think they call you, I don't know why, it sounds like zombies or something, but that's what they call you, graduated from college, okay? And if you add millennials and your generation together, you make up something like 38% of the workforce in the United States, over 50% in a decade, and even more in the countries that you all live in, because you have a much younger population demographic than we have in the West, right? And here's what we know. You all are born digital, okay? And this was written by a colleague of mine in 2008. You grow up in a digital environment. And at the same time, you are increasingly seeking meaning and purpose in your lives. And the pandemic and the protests will only heighten both of these things, the digital part and the meaning and purpose part, right? And this is especially true for lawyers who are recruited and stay into the profession because they want to be a part of something that honors the rule of law, roughly speaking. And here's what I believe about your generation. You'll be like my generation, my parents' generation, who were shaped by the events of World War II and the Great Depression. You are going to be shaped by this experience that we are all living through, right? And there's a reason why we call that generation the greatest generation. Because what did they do? They rebuilt Europe after World War II. They brought us the civil rights movement in the United States, the women's rights movement around the world, the international human rights movement. They rebuilt the global institutional frameworks. I believe that your generation is destined to do equally or more great things coming out of this experience. But there's no guarantee, okay? We've been down the road before. There was a pandemic in, 1918. There have been lots of global upheavals. There have been protests. And that doesn't guarantee change, right? But I do believe that the forces pushing for change this time are particularly urgent. COVID has exposed the underlying interdependence and fragility of our society. And both the pandemic and the protests have made clear that this interdependence and fragility is fundamentally linked to issues of race, class, gender, inequality, and social justice. And the world needs lawyers who understand this critical link between sustainability, social justice, and success, long-term success for all of us, and who are willing to build it into the legal institutions of society, courts, legislatures, all the kind of infrastructure of the rule of law. And lawyers, I believe, who understand this new reality are going to be the ones who serve their clients best and attract the best talent. So here's the thing. The legal profession, it seems to me, faces a fundamental choice. It can retrench and retreat to the comfortable and established ways of 2019, let's just call them. Or it can build and expand to meet the challenges of a new future. And here's what we know. Institutions only survive and grow if the individuals who are subject to them and work with them and control them give them life. One more book. It's a brilliant book by a historian at Yale named Timothy Snyder. It's called On Tyranny. And it's about how democracies can be lost and are being lost. And here's what he says. He says, institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. Look, we need those of you who want to become lawyers to take the legal profession side at this critical time in its history by supporting the highest aspirations of the rule of law, but also by challenging law to confront its consistent failure to live up to these ideals, particularly around race and social justice. And those of you who will not be lawyers, but will be engineers or doctors or professors or business people or a whole range of other things you're studying for, you have a stake in this too, because the rule of law doesn't belong to lawyers. It belongs to everyone who is subject to it. Listen, Gianna Floyd is depending on us. She's depending on you, and she's depending on me, and she's depending on all of us to make the world that she inhabits one that is safer, more equitable, greener, more sustainable, and more just. That's what this program is all about, and that's why it's my honor to be a part of it. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. And Tiara, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll also try to look at the chat if that's helpful, but you guys let me know. I hope that I provoked at least some questions or comments among all of you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was such a thought-provoking session. I know I'm seeing some hearts on the screen and really, really, I mean, as a young person myself, so much to think about and appreciate all of your perspectives. I encourage you all to ask questions to David, especially those of you who have not been able to ask a question at a session before. Please go ahead, raise your hand, or you can type your question in the chat, and I will relay that question to David. Yes, Guillerme is saying that this session was really, really inspiring. I think that's why there was a slower chat, which is very a lot to soak in and really exciting. Humayun is asking for the books that you recommended. If you could repeat the names of those, and I'll send those in the chat.
So why don't I do this? I will promise to just, I'll type out the books and I'll send it to you, and then you can circulate it to everybody so people don't have to write it down.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. I'm seeing a question from Abdullah. Are you able to unmute yourself? Go ahead, Abdullah.
Hi.
We can hear you.
This was a very interesting lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I see that there's a rising trend in the problems surrounding racial inequalities and such. How do you see this change going? How is it gonna transform the social and cultural landscape that we're living in now?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one I really can't pretend to answer. What I'll say to you is this. I think, one of the things that's hard about thinking these problems is two things can be true at the same time. On the one hand, the world is becoming more diverse, more interconnected, we see that the rise of the importance of previously disadvantaged and excluded groups around the world. And at the same time, there's no guarantee that that's actually going to produce social justice. So that's why I kind of tried to give you the example of the sort of the civil rights movement in the United States, which you might say is a combination of three different levels. There was a legal struggle with people challenging laws in the courts around issues of inequality. Then there was a political struggle to try to get people registered to vote and to exercise their power and authority over their governments to make their governments more equitable. And then there is a kind of social movement struggle in which ordinary people went into the streets demanding change. And I think it's a combination of all of those things that in the end is more likely to produce lasting change. You can't just have one or just have the other, because you have to institutionalize change. And that's the hope, anyway, that we're seeing. And again, it goes to young people like you, that you are seeing the importance of this change, and people are increasingly willing to fight for it, to take the institution's side in the way in which that last Timothy Snyder quote I raised.
Thank you so much for the question, Abdullah. Great question. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. David, does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, we can do a few more. And I mean, it's up to you, because I don't want to keep some of these people are up in the middle of the night. So I'm kind of conscious of their time, but I'm happy to do a few more questions.
Sounds good. Gabriel, we'll go to you.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's great, thank you. So, Professor David, I'd like to know, how do you think the Stop Asian movement will affect the world and the economics? Like, this is related to coronavirus, and also it's a racial movement, like Black Lives Matter, sorry. So how do you think this Stop Asian movement will affect the world and change our daily lives?
So I just want to make sure I've got you correctly. Did you say South Asia movement? Oh, is he still there?
Sorry, Stop Asian movement, Stop Asian hate.
Oh, Stop Asian hate. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
Sorry,
sorry. Yes. No, this is really important. As many of you may know, in my country, there's been a terrible, terrible rash of of anti-Asian violence. And the only kind of positive thing one could say is that it's also generated a movement, as you said, Stop Asian Hate, to try to mobilize people against this. And for those of you who, Asian is a funny category. I know that we have people from many different countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And in some ways, these groups, your national identities, your religious and cultural identities, when you come to a place like the United States, or maybe even in the UK or Europe, sometimes all those differences get put together and you get a category like Asian, which is a category that doesn't really exist in any of your countries, but exists in an important way here. And the problem, I suppose, the good thing, if you could say that, about what the current moment is showing is a lot of people thought that, oh, Asians, we don't have to think about them. They're doing fine. There's a phrase, they're the model minority, and they don't have problems. But of course, they have problems, many problems. And there's a lot of discrimination against people from multiple Asian countries and backgrounds here in the United States and around the world. And sadly, my government and the former president here stoked a lot of that by trying to blame China for the coronavirus outbreak. So I'm hoping that this kind of consciousness raising, which happened in the Black community around that time I told you, the civil rights movement, the 1950s, happened in South Africa and the Black consciousness movement. I know I have Brazilians here. I wrote a big book on Brazil. And there's also a Black consciousness movement there happening around Indigenous people and Indigenous rights in places like Australia and New Zealand and here in the United States and Canada, that these issues that people will there's a consciousness raising among groups that will help those groups come together in a way that they can more effectively press for their rights on those three levels that I talked about: the legal level, the political level, and the social movement level. That's the hope, but there's no guarantee. These are hard, intractable problems.
Great, thank you so much for that question, Gabriel. Great question. I'm seeing a lot of really good questions in the chat as well. Pragyanshu brought up how internalized our conceptions of race and caste can be, and I guess the first step of removing that in the mind. That was an interesting comment. And I wanted to go to Divya. Divya had a comment. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. So I read it somewhere that laws are made for lawyers and justice is getting costlier. So the legal fees is getting higher and higher. Even if people want to pursue justice, even in my country, people don't actively pursue it because they think going to lawyers will take more money, take their time. So they try to avoid going to that. So what's your opinion on that issue?
I think sadly it's true, and if I'm correct from your name and your accent, you might be from India. And I wrote part of our globalization project. We wrote a whole book on the Indian legal profession, and it's a real challenge. And I think that's why, in that quote that I read, said to you of Charles Hamilton Houston, who said a lawyer is either a social engineer for justice or a parasite on society. That parasite on society comes from, the fact that lawyers are very expensive and that justice can sometimes only belong to the rich. It's not an easy problem to solve because, of course, those of you who are studying to be lawyers, you have to make a living. You invest a lot of money in becoming a lawyer. A lot of the cost of the justice system is not just because of lawyers, it's because of the whole apparatus that it takes to run a justice system. But we are in a crisis, not just in your country or in my country, although both of our countries have this, but around the world, that access to justice and the rule of law and legal help and legal remedies is becoming more and more out of sight for ordinary people. And it's why we need to, again, work on this on all three levels. So on the legal system level, we need to simplify the laws and make it easier for people to get access to law, even without lawyers. Here, technology can play a big role. Those of you who are interested in being engineers, there's a big movement towards kind of allowing people to learn about the law and get access to it through, you know, their phones and their apps and ways in which we get access to all kinds of other things. It's also kind of a political problem that governments don't invest enough in the structures of law that are for ordinary citizens, not just for the privileged few. And then it is a social movement idea in which lawyers need to work with social movements and disadvantaged communities to help them to access and exercise their rights. In fact, actually, there's a new book, which I will put also when, Tiara, when I send you the books, by a former student of mine named Scott Cummings, who's a professor at the UCLA Law School in California, which is all about the role of lawyers in social movements and how they can work collaboratively with disadvantaged communities in the US and around the world to help make law and legal services more affordable.
Great. Thanks for that question, Divya.
We can do a couple more, Tiara, if you want to continue to do so.
Great. I know I saw some excited faces at that comment. So thank you so much, David, for making the extra time. Iman, we'll go to you.
Me? Hello.
Hello.
Can you? Thank you. It's a great lecture. I want to ask about how can we create more social justice in emerging economy?
So I think emerging economies, you know, are so important for those of you. So the project that I run, and I'll put the names of these books in the chat too. We wrote a book on India. We then wrote a book on Brazil. We have a book on China about to come out. And we're now beginning research in Africa, several African countries in both North, South, and East Africa, and in ASEAN countries, and we want to move eventually to Eastern Europe. So there are a few things I think that emerging economies have to focus on. One is how to develop the kind of, what really my project is mostly about, is how to develop the kinds of lawyers who can protect the country's interests in negotiations with global multinationals, local multinationals, NGOs, World Trade Organization, right? Because partly what emerging economies need to develop is they need to link their economies in a productive way to the global economy. And that means foreign direct investment. It means things like privatization. It means influx of capital. It means educational opportunity. And there's a whole range of issues there that countries around the world, since really the 1990s, are beginning to face. That's one set of things. A whole nother set of things is what we just talked about public service, about access to justice, about making sure that law and legal institutions are accessible and available to the interests of ordinary citizens. That is another huge thing. And finally, how do we educate people about law and legal institutions and their legal rights? Because again, it's not just the going to a lawyer and filing a lawsuit or a case. That should be the last resort. The first resort should be people understand what their rights are and how to protect them themselves. And so there's a whole education campaign around the rule of law, which again, I think technology is useful for, but it's also education. Many of you are not studying to be lawyers, most of you, but you need to know something about law and your legal rights because they're going to affect things like being a doctor, or being an engineer, or being a teacher, or being a scientist, right? All of these things interact with law. And so I think we need to work on all three of these things together.
Okay, thank you.
Great question, Iman. David, how are you feeling on time?
Okay, I see we've got a few people with their hands up in the thing. So why don't we do this? Maybe if people we could perhaps ask all the questions and then I could try to respond to them.
Okay, great. That's really kind of you. Thank you, David, for making that space. Okay, so I'll unmute three students, and three students, you can ask your questions, and then I'll hand it over to David. So Mateus, first over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So hello, Professor. Thank you so much for everything. I'm majoring in public relations, communication studies, and I wonder how important is for us that are not preparing to become lawyers is to understand and study different legislations in order to become more prepared agents of transformation in society. So if you have any advice on how to prepare in this sense, thank you.
Terrific.
Thanks, Mateus. Shukrala, will go to you. Able to unmute yourself. Glenda, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hello, do you hear me?
Oh, go ahead, Shukla. Sorry.
How can we maintain?
Not hearing Shukra.
So Shukla, I think your internet is cutting out. Can you please type your question and then we can read your question out loud? Does that sound okay? And Glenda, are you able to unmute yourself?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. First of all, thanks for this session. I think this was great, especially in the moment that we are living right now. It gives us hope in some ways. So the question I want to ask is, Professor David, do you think that the way that companies are promoting the LGBT Pride Month is also a type of social engineering? To what extent do you believe this promotes the end of homophobia in the corporate world? It seems to me that it's much more for marketing itself, not for real social impact.
Terrific, good question.
Great question, Glenda. And we have one more question, Shukla. We'll give you a second to type in the chat. Or we can go to Mabuso. Are you able to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say, nice lecture, Professor. I just want to ask. So the question that I want to ask is more or less the same as the previous colleague has asked. In terms of, the Milton Friedman statement of, the conclusion of, running a business at the end of the day is basically, for the profit margin. Don't you think then there's a lot of hypocrisy and ambiguous effects created in terms of companies? They know that we need to survive in this environment where, there's racial killings like the George Floyd. So now they're gonna obviously advertise that, we stand with this and everything like that. So don't you think there's a little bit of hypocrisy in that? And an example that I can give is, in South Africa, I'm from South Africa, pre-1994, we had, apartheid. And the reason why it stopped, it wasn't because, the white people were marching. Well, there were some white people marching saying that it must stop. It was because it was getting tough on them in terms of, the economy, understand? And then they decided for it to stop. So basically, that's what I want to ask. Thank you very much.
So those are all great questions. Maybe if Shukra is still typing, let me answer the ones there. And if he has a chance to ask, I don't want to leave him out. So let me just put Glenda and the last questions together, because I think they are great questions. And there is no question that there is, you could call it, actually, this also relates to the public, my friend who does the public relations is studying. Yes, there's marketing, there's public relations. I mean, I say only half jokingly that now, since in the last year, if you look on television, every commercial, every couple that is shown on the commercial is an interracial couple. Like literally every single one, you know, blacks or whites, blacks and Latinos, even you go to LGBTQ issues, even gay couples are shown as interracial couples, or they have interracial children, or all that. Now, yes, that is trying to pick up on marketing and trying to both avoid consumer backlash and also to maybe get consumers who are interested in these issues. That's true. It's also true that we used to complain bitterly. I know, because I'm old enough to remember when there were no blacks on commercials, in which companies thought you could not market a product to a general audience by having a black face as its marketing. And you certainly don't show interracial commercials. In fact, Cheerios, some of you know it's a breakfast cereal here, had a commercial in which there was an interracial couple and a little interracial little girl talking to her father about Cheerios, who was white. And Cheerios got huge hate mail about this advertisement. So here's what I want to say, and this goes to my marketing friend. Symbols matter, right? I mean, we can't both complain that symbols, that we are left out of culture and we're left out of cultural symbols and there's no representation of us on television, and then say every time there is that it doesn't matter and it's meaningless. Those two things are in tension with each other. Now, it doesn't mean that just because you put black people and white people on your commercials that you're going to change your hiring practices or you're going to change your investment practices. And you are absolutely right that the Milton Friedman ethos still drives, listen, corporations are going to care about their profits. And frankly, unless you think there's a system out there that doesn't involve some degree of capitalism, it's pretty hard to imagine an economic system in which organizations don't care about their profits. If they don't care about their profits, they go out of business. If they go out of business, they are not only not good for their investors, but for their employees, for the communities they serve, et cetera, right? That's one of the challenges of emerging economies, is that people are trying to understand how to make successful businesses, because one of the most important human rights in the world is a job. And that's not just for the economic reasons, but it's also for dignity. It's also for learning. It's for all the things that jobs are critical for. If you want jobs, you need people who are going to be able to give people jobs. So yes, I tell people all the time, if you expect Google or Apple or Facebook, forget whatever these are companies you're probably more familiar with, or General Motors or Toyota, to turn into social welfare or social justice organizations, that is a mistaken, that's never going to happen. But it doesn't mean that we can't hold those organizations accountable for both the harms that they create and also to push them to do better around the issues that all of you rightly care about. And your example in South Africa is exactly this point, that you're totally right, that South Africa did not get rid of apartheid. Botha did not, and the Nationalist Party, they didn't give up apartheid because they were convinced of the moral argument, but the world was convinced of the moral argument, and enough people put enough pressure on enough politicians and corporations to exercise a global boycott of South African companies that were doing business in apartheid. And I have some familiarity with that because as a young lawyer, I used to get people out of jail who were arrested for protesting in front of the South African embassy in the early 1980s. Those protests eventually translated into, so remember the three levels. There's mobilization and movement level. Then that generated political pressure on the US government, which passed sanctions on South Africa, on the government and companies that did business in South Africa, which then put legal pressure, put pressure inside of South Africa to create a new constitutional framework, which, you know, the South African business elites, they did it partly in their self-interest. And as you know better than I do, the deal in South Africa was to trade political power for economic power, so that the economic power, roughly speaking, whether it was landowners or, you know, De Beers and the people who own the 20 families that own 50% or 70% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. But that deal was made to avoid what would otherwise have been clearly a horribly bloody revolution, in which many, 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 many Blacks and other people of color would have died, because South Africa had a very elite and deadly armed services. And then it created not just a new political regime, but a new legal regime. So Black economic empowerment, and the number of Blacks who are now in positions of now economic power, not just political power. Again, does that guarantee change? No. What it means is now there is an entry point to say, okay, those people who got those positions have a responsibility to use those positions of authority to do what I said was the Brown dividend. And I wrote an article about this. I'll put it in Tiara. I'll put also that in the message that I sent to you. So again, I don't want you to be gullible and to think that just because, you know, you have LGBTQ people and you have marketing and you have statements, that necessarily means real change in the fundamentals of how the organization operates. But it's not nothing. And it provides a wedge. So remember when I said the US civil rights, the legal system changed and said it was illegal to segregate Blacks and whites in schools. That didn't change for 10 years until we had a political movement and a social movement to change it. But once that movement got going, it could point to the fact that it was a legal right. And it was very hard for people who to both claim they believed in the rule of law and also to say, but I'm not for guaranteeing the legal right that is there is the law of the land. Symbols matter, which comes now to my friend in public relations. I don't think you need to study kind of law like a lawyer studies. But I think what all of you should understand is, how does your legal system operate? What is good about it? What's bad about it? And how does it affect the interests of the particular segment of the world or the population that you are a part of, or the business that you're in, or the profession that you're in, and how to change it? Because you have a stake in the rule of law, which has a huge effect on how the rest of society operates. It doesn't determine it. There are lots of things that happen notwithstanding what the law says, but it's a big piece of it. Just as lawyers should know enough about business, technology, science, medicine, engineering, enough so that they can realize the ways in which these domains increasingly influence the way in which we think about law and the rule of law and the work of lawyers, and how we can bring these different domains together to solve complex problems. So I'll leave you with this. I think the great thing about your generation is that you are the most educated, most savvy, most globally connected generation ever in the history of the world. And I do believe that you understand all of the flaws of the world that my generation has left you, and that you want to do something about it. And I think you should do something about it, and you should press, and you should not take things at face value, and you should be skeptical. But you also have to move beyond being skeptical to figuring out how to build something, because these are hard problems. And I promise you, there have been people of goodwill before who've tried to think about them. And they're only going to be solved if we come together in that spirit, as Tiara said at the beginning, of openness and willingness to engage with each other and ask hard questions, but to listen hard too, to build new institutions that institutionalize social justice and change. Because if it doesn't get institutionalized, then even if there's a charismatic leader, even if there's a temporary change, things will move back to the way they were. The status quo and hierarchy reasserts itself fundamentally unless you build institutions and structures of change that live both in the real world and in the hearts and minds of amazing people like you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I can't wait to see the amazing things that you will do in the world. I hope maybe I'll have a chance to visit with you again someday, and maybe some of you will come to Cambridge and we'll be able to meet in person, or I'll come to your countries and be able to meet you and see the amazing things that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was definitely a tough tough act to follow. Yeah, I think as a young person myself, that was so inspiring, and thank you so much for talking about so many different things with the questions and really thinking about. I really appreciate your point about it's good to be skeptical and also to start to build something. I think really beautiful to see this community of young leaders around the world manifesting that. So thank you so much. I know there's a lot of comments for you in the chat, thank yous and things students learn. So we'll send those over to you.
And Tiara, will you send me the chat? Can you do that?
Yes, I will do that. So those of you who had questions in the chat as well, I know Pragyanshu, for example, we didn't get to your question. So I'm sorry about that, but we'll send it over in the chat. Thank you so much, David, for lending your time to Crossroads this morning and learned so much. And I know the students did too. So thank you. Feel free to hop off. For students, I'll leave the chat open